We now have Anton Korinek, an old friend of the ATW, who's been there practically right from the beginning, I think.
Yeah, that's right. My first time was when the first workshop took place, and that was the summer I wrote my dissertation.
Right.
And I still remember, which you're not supposed to in one summer, by the way. I still remember when I was at the workshop, I stayed up very late every night because it was so late with everything already. And I wrote basically the core of my job market at the ATW.
Great. Well, Anton, then you came as a student, or you first time, or you came as a...
Yeah, the first time was as a job candidate.
Right. And then he's come subsequent lecture. Anton did his PhD at Columbia, supervised Joe Stiglitz, and has maintained with us links in various ways. He works with the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, teaches at the University of Maryland.
Actually,
and John Hopkins, yes, sorry, I forgot about that. And NBER, and you know his topic, and you will have a wonderful time listening to him, I have no doubt. Anton, all yours.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me here. I had a little bit of a rough arrival today. I was supposed to come in at 2 a.m., but then my flight was about to land and took off again due to the fog, and flew to Chennai and then flew back and finally arrived at 6. Then I had a taxi ride here. So I'm not completely at my best, but I hope you will bear with me. So how many of you are actually economists, and how many are sociologists, and how many are from other fields? Let's say, how many are economists? Oh wow, that's a vast majority actually. How many are not? Okay, and you are from?
University of Cambridge.
From what field?
Legal theory.
Legal theory, very interesting. I think you said before public health. What other fields do we have here?
It's more political economy, so straddling economy and politics. So.
Okay, and I think over there were also a number of non-economists.
Public health.
Public health also. Who is public health? And what other fields do we have represented?
Urban planning.
Urban planning. And was that everybody now? Okay, well, we do have a very good and mixed crowd. Actually, I like non-economists much better. So yeah, what I will talk about is capital controls and the international monetary system. And I was told to give a lecture that's not too technical, so I think it will be very accessible to the non-economists as well. And if you have any economic questions about it, feel free nonetheless to interrupt me as well. Is there a clicker, or is this the clicker?
You need to press the.
You have to use that.
To speak about, in the context of the international monetary system, is basically at first how views of what we need to worry about in the international monetary system have evolved in recent decades. So if we go back a couple of decades, the view was that the main problem in emerging economies and developing economies is that they suffer from financial repression, that therefore investment is insufficient, the allocation of capital is suboptimal, and all of that is holding back growth in these economies. So in some sense, the old battleground is therefore to fight financial repression via liberalization and therefore get the economy growing faster. So the view among, I think it's fair to say, a majority of economists at the time was that there is a trade-off between stability and efficiency, and if we want more efficiency and more growth, we need to liberalize and we need to sacrifice some stability for that. Please.
What does financial repression mean?
Oh, financial repression basically means that you impose lots and lots of regulations on the financial system, and you don't allow capital markets to intermediate a lot of capital.
So
What's your
the
view?
strongest version of that would have been where they keep interest rates very low. And then the argument would be that you didn't get savings and therefore no investment. Now, can I guess, there was also a view that the extreme view was that there was no trade-off. That integration to global financial markets would lead to more stability and efficiency. That the capital would flow to countries when they needed it, and so it was actually better to be integrated. So they didn't. There was one. The IMF actually thought there was no trade-off. You got both more efficiency and more stability.
But the development economics community thought roughly along these lines.
That's right.
By the way, what's your name?
Oh, Amrit. Sorry, I left my... Amrit.
Amrit.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so, what we have seen over time in the past 2-3 decades was that for an increasing number of countries, those controls, this financial repression, has been swept away. And what followed was, well, so at first at least, the supply of capital was much improved. A lot of capital flowed in, for example, from international investors. But the problem was that these liberalized markets brought not only at first a greater supply of capital, but also unprecedented instability and crisis. And the problem was during a crisis, so much capital left the country that it was actually less than was what flowed in at first. And overall, those economies had more instability and not even necessarily a greater supply of capital. So the new battleground that emerged from this problem was that global economic policymakers had to fight a lot of financial instability, had to fight a lot of financial crisis. And nowadays, what we have to work on is we have to work on fighting financial instability via re-regulation in order to get more stability, but also more efficiency, in order to avoid these boom-bust cycles and to avoid all these crises that ultimately hurt growth. So what I have depicted here, it's a graph from the famous book of Reinhard and Rogoff, and it's not about the 90%, so it means you can feel comfortable discussing it. So the blue line here is, no, let me start with the red line. The red line is an indicator of capital mobility. And you can see the graph goes from 1800 to basically now. You can see over the 1800s, capital mobility increased. It reached kind of a peak in the early 20th century. And then after the First World War, and in particular after the Second World War, capital mobility declined sharply. And then it took off again as more and more economies liberalized. Now the blue line is an indicator of financial instability. So it is the share of countries that experience a banking crisis, which is in most developing countries a good indicator for general financial crisis. And you can see that there is a pretty close relationship between those two
What's the measure of capital mobility?
The measure of capital mobility, I think here in this graph, is actually a measure of realized capital flows. But I have to admit, I have not assembled it myself. I've gotten it straight from Carmen's book. So, yeah, but what at least this graph suggests is that there is a relatively close relationship between financial capital flow mobility and financial instability. Now, that means that there is, based on this view, there's a very good reason to worry about capital flow regulation and to think about how we can best address the instability brought by financial and capital flows into emerging economies. Now, for the economists among us, one of the fundamental tenets that we believe in is that if we regulate something, we should regulate based on some clearly identifiable market imperfections. So we should not just say, well, we don't like capital, we should regulate, but we should think carefully about what the market imperfections are that we're trying to address. And our regulations work best if we target them precisely at the market imperfections that we're trying to address. So the approach that I want to take in much of the remainder of my talk now is I want to observe that countries are wary of capital flows because of the risk of financial crisis, and therefore I want to analyze the desirability of free capital flows, of capital flow regulation, precisely in our best economic models of financial crisis. So, which brings me back to a short history of financial crisis models. So, the international finance economists tend to categorize models of financial crisis into generations. And the different generations of models of crisis that we describe correspond to different crisis episodes as we've observed them in the past couple of decades. So the first generation model of financial crisis was something that was actually, I think it was one of the very first papers of Paul Krugman. And it described financial crisis as a situation where a country fixes its exchange rate but at an overvalued level, and as the exchange rate is too high, the country has a persistent current account deficit and loses reserves and loses more and more and more reserves, up until at some point when it has lost too many reserves, there's a speculative attack and the exchange rate collapses. So in that kind of model, the problem is that the government set the exchange rate at the wrong level. What's the best
You don't have to have a speculative attack if you're using reserve. There's just a limit to how far you can go.
Yes, so in the model what happens is, actually, before your reserves reach zero, there will be a speculative attack when everybody runs on you and basically clears out the remaining stock of reserves. So they don't wait until they reach zero, because then an arbitrage position primary, but they attack when they still have a significant stock. But yeah. So in second generation models, which were inspired by, for example, the crisis of the European exchange rate mechanism in the early 1990s, the problem is that the government is not tough enough and it cannot commit to defending an exchange rate peg, and because of that, there will be an interest rate premium, and the
Can
economy
people
will
at the
suffer.
back here? Sorry. No, sorry.
Okay. Okay, good. And because of that, the economy will suffer and the country experience a crisis. But again, the problem is that the government does something wrong. Then the third generation models of crisis were inspired by the East Asian crisis, and at first those models observed that, well, there is moral hazard. In all the East Asian countries, somebody got bailed out, and we know now, even if the US has a financial crisis, somebody gets bailed out. So that leads to moral hazard, so therefore the problem is that the government guarantees financial institution or borrowers, and basically the general lesson from all these earlier models of financial crisis is, if only government fixed its historic policies, then everything would be fine. Now, at some point, people started to realize that this is not quite the full story. And it was really the East Asian crisis in 97, 98 that forced a rethink among economists, and that basically highlighted that at the center of most financial crises, and I think it's true for most financial crises since, are balance sheet problems. So it means that there are people who have borrowed too much, just like in the European countries now, or in the US financial crisis a couple years ago. And these balance sheet problems imply that there's people who are constrained in their access to credit, who cannot borrow to buy new investments, to buy new houses, and are a market phenomenon that does not have anything to do with distorted government policies, but it has to do with financial market imperfections. And so what I want to focus on in the remainders is I want to focus on the financial market phenomena that trigger such crises. And I want to analyze how should we think about the desirability of capital flows in such models of balance sheet crisis. So what I have here schematically depicted is basically a prototype model of balance sheet crisis. The general problem when you have a significant part of your economy that experiences balance sheet problems is, I have already foreshadowed that there will be a decline in aggregate demand. Now, if aggregate demand declines, then small economies, and most developing emerging economies are relatively small, experience depreciations in their exchange rate because foreigners demand less domestic goods than domestic nations. So it means if there is a decline in domestic demand, the exchange rate needs to fall to clear the market. When the exchange rate falls, the problem in emerging market economies is that balance sheets contract even further because a lot of borrowers have taken on foreign currency debt. So if balance sheets deteriorate further, then aggregate demand worsens, and the exchange rate declines further, and we basically have a feedback loop in which the initial problems get amplified, and a relatively small economic shock can lead to a massive economic crisis. So that's the basic intuition of balance sheet crisis models. Now, we can also describe this phenomenon algebraically. So the exchange rate in pretty much any model is a function of aggregate demand. The borrowing ability of individual countries is a function of the exchange rate because we have these contractionary depreciations. And aggregate demand in turn is a function of how much agents can borrow. So we have a system of three simultaneous equations in three variables that we can solve for. And in that system, you can see that since all these partial derivatives are, well, sorry, two are positive, one is negative, you can see that the result of a shock is that you will have an amplified response of the economy.
Are you implicitly assume fixed exchange rate in this case, or fixed
No, in this
nominal?
case, the exchange rate is flexible. And
That's the real or the nominal?
well, actually, here I haven't specified what kind it is, right? It could be either. Now, in the simplest models, like in the model in a paper that I think was distributed here, it is a real exchange rate. But you can think about it in very similar terms in the nominal exchange rate, because declining aggregate demand will generally depreciate the nominal exchange rate. The only way to prevent that is to raise interest rates, which also has a negative effect on balance sheets. So when you are a country in this kind of situation, there's really no way out. No matter if you let your exchange rate decline and you get the balance sheet effects, or you defend the exchange rate and you raise interest rates, you will have a negative effect on aggregate demand. What's your name?
Gonzalo. Gonzalo.
Gonzalo. Thank you, Gonzalo. Yeah, so that's an important observation. And actually, it's even worse than that. It's not only the exchange rate that plays part in these crises, but it's also generally asset prices. So think, for example, of housing prices in the US. When aggregate demand declines, people generally also buy fewer houses or fewer other durable assets, and the prices of durable assets go down. That also hurts balance sheets. So for example, homeowners' balance sheets will be affected negatively, and they can borrow less, and then again hurts everyone. Essentially.
We've talked about the inframarginal effects on balance sheets of the phenomena you're interested in. But what about survival constraints of firms? Doesn't that add an additional dimension to strengthen your argument?
I think that's a very good point. So here in this schematic picture here, I haven't really tied myself down to whether there's a balance sheet of existing firms or whether there's some firms that go bust. And I think you're absolutely right that one of the main channels through which these mechanisms play out is a large number of bankruptcies. So for example, in Indonesia, in the 1997-98 financial crisis, 95% of all firms went bankrupt. And we can also view that as kind of a generalized balance sheet effect. Basically, if you're bankrupt, you cannot borrow and invest anymore, and you will also have a negative effect on aggregate demand. So yeah, thank you. That's a very important mechanism.
Can you just a word more about your aggregate demand and exchange rate and how that works?
Oh, here. So Gonzalo observed that, well, there's two different stories. There is a real exchange rate and there's a nominal exchange rate. The simpler channel to analyze algebraically is the real exchange rate, because we don't need to worry about monetary policy. So that's what makes looking at the real exchange rate much simpler. The real exchange rate is the price of a domestic consumption basket in terms of an international consumption basket, right? So how much consumption would foreigners have to give up to buy consumption in our domestic economy? And that means it consists of the price of domestic non-traded and domestic traded goods. Now, what is true about domestic non-traded goods? Who are the only agents buying them? Domestic agents, because we cannot trade them by definition. So that means the price of domestic non-traded goods goes down, and since they form an important part of this basket, even if the price of domestic traded goods were to remain fixed, our real exchange rate would decline. Generally, even domestic traded goods go down in price. So that would be the first mechanism. The second mechanism is if we analyze a nominal exchange rate. So the nominal exchange rate is driven on the one hand by the real exchange rate, but on the other hand also by monetary and exchange rate policy. So if monetary policy follows some passive rule, for example, if monetary policy would target a fixed rate of inflation, then the nominal exchange rate would just replicate the decline in the real exchange rate. On the other hand, and I should say that's also true if the exchange rate policy is just to keep money supply fixed. On the other hand, if the central bank tries to defend the exchange rate, which countries oftentimes do, then it can keep the exchange rate a little bit higher, but at the expense of increasing the interest rate in the economy. So then there would be an alternative channel that hurts aggregate demand. And that's actually an interesting question these days, because we know that in the past 6 months roughly, there's been quite a number of countries that have faced the problem that their exchange rates have declined at the end of a bust, and they are unsure now whether they should raise interest rates to defend the exchange rate or whether they should let the exchange rate slide. And different countries that are in similar situations have taken different routes in this dimension. Yeah.
Where did such a process start? I mean, is there the balance?
It's true, there's no start to this circle, right?
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
you know, where some external shock to what?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very important question because nothing happens from nothing. So, yeah, the interesting thing is that it could be a shock to really any of these three elements. So, oftentimes it is a shock that hits aggregate demand for some extraneous reason. Imagine, for example, you're a big commodity exporter and the price of what you're exporting suddenly declines, but everything else stays the same. That constitutes a large demand shock for your economy, and it sets in motion this adjustment mechanism. So as a response to the demand shock, the exchange rate goes down, and then you start having balance sheet effects, and the whole feedback loop is triggered. Sometimes the initial shock is to the exchange rate. So that can be the case, for example, when there is contagion from one economy to the other, when international investors suddenly attack your exchange rate, and that leads to balance sheet effects and aggregate demand problems and triggers the whole feedback loop. So I think during a lot of series of financial crises, like for example during the East Asian crisis, those types of speculative attacks were a little bit involved in the later countries that experienced crisis. And then it can also start with the balance sheet. It can start with, for example, large companies going bankrupt, or it can start with homeowners who realize they have suddenly taken on too much debt. And that also leads to aggregate demand problems and triggers the whole. So yeah, that's the interesting thing about this channel. You can start in. And your name was?
Anita.
Thank you, Anita. Sorry, there was
Just a brief question.
Oh.
I mean, it doesn't have to be, in order to have a balance sheet effect, it doesn't have to be borrowing necessarily, right, in kind of foreign currency, because quite a couple of countries don't have firms borrowing abroad. However, they have a lot of influx of portfolio investment
Yeah.
or whatever, right?
Yeah,
So-
that's right. So that's an important observation, and it also goes back to what we discussed with Gonzalo before. It can also involve just asset prices.
Okay.
And you're right that a number of countries nowadays have kind of fixed the problem that they have foreign currency debts, and it has made them more resilient to drops in the exchange rate, but they're still vulnerable to drops in asset prices.
Sure.
Your name was?
Eva.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Forgive me, I'm a microeconomist, so all of this is a bit beyond me. But it sounds to me like the story that you're describing is suggesting that this kind of original state, whatever it is some kind of unstable equilibrium. And any little shock leads to this kind of spiraling away from the unstable equilibrium. But there are always shocks of one kind or another. So then how would you even be in that unstable equilibrium in the first place? Forgive me if that's a really stupid question.
No, that's an excellent question. And your name is?
Natalie.
Thank you, Natalie. That's an excellent question. So, what I have described here is the feedback mechanism that occurs once these balance sheet problems are active. So, what I have implicitly assumed is that balance sheets are in a state where they determine aggregate demand. Now, if we are during really good economic times, then people can take small shocks to the balance sheets without any problems. So I hope it won't happen, but for example, if I walk outside and somebody steals whatever money I have in my wallet, it will not affect my demand because I have a cushion in my balance sheet.
That's nice to know.
So basically, this feedback mechanism is at work whenever balance sheets are a determining force for aggregate demand, which is usually the case when they're overstretched. So one way of looking at it is a healthy economy has healthy balance sheets. If you shock it a little bit, it has very little effect on aggregate demand, only basically the wealth effect, which we know is small. If you shock it more, you will reach a stage when balance sheets become tightened, and when you start to become constrained. And after that, any additional shock will immediately feed into demand. So that's, I think, the best way of thinking about why this system can become unstable, whereas economies sometimes still are stable.
Kind of threshold effect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's also the case that it doesn't necessarily, given the spiral, that spiral is out of control. That is to say, it amplifies the original shock, but isn't necessarily unstable. So it's larger than the original shock, but finite.
So in most of the models I write down, I assume that the amplification is not strong enough to basically kill the economy. Because it's much easier to write models that find amplified equilibrium than to write models where the economy completely diverges. But what's also interesting is there can be different stages of these amplification effects. There can be multiple equilibria when this effect is strong over some region and then weaker again over some other region. So generically, these balance sheet models, they have very rich dynamics, but since they're so rich, economists generally simplify them to get rid of the mathematical complications. Okay, so now this brings us to the next question, which is what are the efficiency considerations in such a model of balance sheet effects? And as you can see here in the first line, there are externalities when such financial amplification effects are in play. So let's look at the role of exchange rate depreciations in first a well-functioning economy in which balance sheets are healthy, and then contrast that with an economy in which these balance sheet effects are at play. So first of all, in a healthy economy, or let's say in a standard neoclassical economy, or an economy like Adam Smith has described it, the exchange rate plays an equilibrating role. It's good that the exchange rate depreciates when we have an adverse shock, because that's the way how the market makes demand and supply re-equilibrate. So, in other words, when we have a strong aggregate demand shock, we need a depreciation in the exchange rate to make our exports cheaper and our imports more expensive, so that we go back to full employment in the economy. And in some ways we can even say the correct price adjustment is the basis of what makes the economy work so well. We need those price adjustments, because otherwise there would be a shortage of demand or supply somewhere, and the system would be off equilibrium. Now that's when everything works well. But as Natalie observed, if we have balance sheet effects, then the system no longer works so well. And what is supposed to be an equilibrating force, which is that the exchange rate depreciates or that asset prices decline, suddenly has contractionary effects on the economy. So in a sense, the self-stabilizing role of the market is impeded, and as a result of that, the welfare theorems no longer hold in that kind of economy, and there is a generic role for policy intervention. So, how do these externalities manifest themselves? Well, so in a decentralized economy, individual market participants are supposed to take prices as given. And small market participants always find it optimal to take prices as given. And they also find it optimal to take the exchange rate as given. So market participants trade and borrow and lend and do all these things, taking as given that the exchange rate is at whichever level it is, and taking as given that there may be a financial crisis or there may be no financial crisis tomorrow, but they act as price takers. Now the problem is, as we have seen from the feedback loop, if everybody acts in this way, taking the exchange rate as given, there is still this general equilibrium effect that creates balance sheet effects and that creates contractions in aggregate demand and all the associated economic problems. So in general, we call those pecuniary externalities, and for those of us who are economists, we are taught in Micro 101 that pecuniary externalities don't matter for precisely this argument that I made on the previous slide. But in the context of balance sheet effects, the pecuniary externalities become very relevant. And since individual market participants take the exchange rate as given, they take too many actions that may lead to exchange rate depreciations and too few actions that can keep the exchange rate appreciated in those crises. So in particular, when they make their financing and investment decisions, they receive an excessive level of capital inflows, which pushes up the exchange rate during the good times, but pushes it down excessively during crisis times. They choose inflows that are too risky, so for example, dollar debt instead of foreign direct investment, or instead of local currency debt, as I think Eva observed. They take on maturities that are too short because it exposes them to additional rollover risk. They also make investments in real projects that are excessively risky, and they integrate excessively with global financial markets. So all these decision margins will be distorted in economies that have these balance sheet effects because of the pecuniary externalities arising from the exchange rate or from asset prices. So what does this kind of theory of balance sheet crisis provide us with? Well, it provides us not only of a story that describes how the crises work, but also why private agents take on excessive crisis risk. So we have a unified theory of both crisis and crisis exposure. Now, the next question that I want to discuss is how should policy intervene in order to internalize those externalities? So we said one of the fundamental tenets in economics is you should only address market imperfections that you have clearly identified. We have already identified now what the market imperfection is. So the next step is to analyze how we can fix them, or at least mitigate them. So policymakers' job is basically to internalize these externalities. They should have to internalize that private risk-taking or private excess borrowing leads to social losses because of these feedback loops, because of these financial amplification effects. And regulation should align the private and social incentives to borrow and invest. So the optimal intervention in financial markets, optimal intervention in capital flows should depend on the type of capital flows, on the maturity of flows, on whatever domestic conditions the economy has, and whatever the global macro factors are. So let me talk about these steps in a little bit more detail. The first question I want to ask is, well, how should our optimal regulations depend on the type of capital inflows that we receive? And for that, I want to go back again a little bit to some equations. So we can precisely measure the magnitude of externalities from capital flows by studying crisis episodes, maybe with the one caveat that I've written here, that crises are relatively infrequent events. But I think the best we can do, given that we have observed quite a number of financial crises in the past 2-3 decades, we can say, well, what were the externalities in the financial crisis we observed in the past decade to extrapolate what we may observe in the future.
Do a randomized control trial by inducing a lot of crises, you know.
That's right. Yeah. Basically, what I want to discuss here, and what I have done in more detail in the paper that has been distributed, if it is the paper that I think that has been distributed, is that I want to go through how we can measure the externality of a $1 outflow in order to determine what would be the optimal tax to impose in a $1 inflow. So if we think through the steps and through what created the externality, what created the balance sheet effects, then you can see that a $1 capital outflow in those states of nature when balance sheet effects are active, as Natalie observed, will create sorry, I have not introduced any of the verbs, so let me ignore the equation written here and let me replace it by words. So a $1 capital outflow will lead to a certain amount of decline in the exchange rate. That decline in the exchange rate will lead to a certain balance sheet effect, so to a certain decline in our borrowing capacity. And that decline in our borrowing capacity has a certain social cost, which we can measure by basically how tight the financial constraints in Asians are, by the shadow price that Asians have on their borrowing constraints. So we basically need to measure these three different magnitudes. The first one is, how much do capital outflows affect the exchange rate? The second is, how much does the exchange rate affect balance sheets? And the third one is, how tight are financial constraints? Now, given this rich sample of financial crises that Akbar described, we have a number of observations that we can use to estimate those three clearly identifiable magnitudes. And that gives us what I want to call an externality kernel, and I generally described it by the variable tau. So for those of you who have done pricing theory in finance, we describe pricing kernels in order to determine asset prices. And the way we usually proceed is we say, well, the asset price in an economy is the expectation of the pricing kernel times the return on that asset. Now, I can do the same thing using this externality kernel. The pricing kernel is generally the private benefit of asset payoffs. The externality kernel is the social benefit or cost of an asset payoff. So we can use the product of this externality kernel and the return of whatever asset we look at in order to determine the total magnitude of externalities of a particular financial asset, and a policymaker can impose a tax that corresponds precisely to the size of that externality in order to make the equilibrium socially efficient again. So, if we look at different financial assets like foreign currency debt, local currency debt, FDI, they all have different returns. Some of them pay back a lot when we hit the financial crisis state, like for example dollar debt. Others pay back very little in crisis states, like for example FDI. And depending on the payoff in crisis states, the expected value of the externality is higher or lower. So to go back to Natalie's observation, when we don't have a financial crisis, when we don't have any balance sheet effects, there is no externality. So in those states of nature, our externality kernel is 0. And in those states where we have big crises, our externality kernel is very high. Now, if we look at the payoff profile of dollar debt, or foreign currency debt more generally, foreign currency debt pays back the most in those crisis states because that's when our exchange rate depreciates the most. And that's why foreign currency debt generally has the highest externalities. And I have listed that here on this slide here. So this is based actually on the magnitude of externalities during the Indonesian financial crisis of 97-98. I report 3 different columns here that give us for all the different financial assets that we look at, what was the return in the financial crisis. So the return if you had borrowed or taken on $1 of liabilities in mid-97 and you have to repay it in mid-98. If you borrowed $1, you have to pay back 2.18 times as much in real terms. So this is already adjusted for inflation because the exchange rate in Indonesia depreciated so much during the crisis. If you borrowed in GDP indexed debt, which was dollar denominated, your return on the dollar debt was reduced because the economy shrank, but it was still foreign currency, so it's still a very high return. By definition, CPI indexed debt repays exactly 100%. Rupiah debt repaid less than par because the rupiah depreciated so much, and this is a real depreciation, so it's adjusted for inflation already. And then portfolio investments are returned even less because the stock market index declined. And finally, and this now is the one number that's not based on actual data, but it's basically imputed as 0 because most companies have very low returns and were not able to pay any dividends. But yeah, so these are the payoffs. So if we go back to our pricing equation, those are the R's in the crisis. The externality kernel, the tau, was 14.1%. So having a 1 unit capital outflow had a 14.1 cent externality. So for every $100 that leave the country, there's an additional social cost of $14, in other words. And that implies that the externality of having borrowed $1 in 97 was 30 cents because dollar appreciated, and you can see it was declining for these more and more contingent forms of finance. And then in the last column, I asked the following question. I said, well, based on the frequency of crisis in Indonesia over the past 20 years, we had one episode, so let's say if we want to impose a constant tax on these different financial instruments, it should be exactly 1/20th of that. So what should be the tax on a $1 inflow of debt or of local currency debt or portfolio investment and so on? and it should be a 1.5% tax on dollar, 0.44% tax on local currency inflows, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, a number of countries have already done that. They have imposed regulations or taxes on foreign currency debt, right? And that has mitigated this problem. I should add, though, that sometimes they have done it in a very incomplete way. So, for example, in some countries, they have imposed regulations that the banking system is not allowed to take on any foreign currency mismatch. But the way that banks deal with that is they borrow in dollars and they lend in dollars to local companies, some of them completely non-tradable companies. And if the currency really depreciates, then their borrowers cannot pay them back because it is de facto local currency debt. So what matters is not the official match or mismatch on bank balance sheets, but it's the de facto mismatch. And in a number of countries where banks look very well matched at present, there is actually a significant mismatch in the corporate sector.
Banks typically banks have risk premium when they lend in this way. Borrowing dollars, lending dollars to companies.
I mean, they oftentimes are happy to lend at a higher interest rate in the local currency. It's very difficult to disentangle how much of that premium on local currency borrowing is risk premium and how much is expected depreciation. But oftentimes they pocket it as if it was a pure risk premium, even though it is expected depreciation. But I guess the main point is that even if you earn a return that makes up for the risk, you're still not hedged. And you're still vulnerable to these feedback loops and balance sheet dynamics. And that's the big problem. Okay. So now how can we implement those tax measures or controls in practice? Well, on the previous slide, I discussed everything as if we can just impose a pure tax. Now, for institutional reasons, in a lot of countries, it is actually much more common to impose reserve requirements. So a lot of countries prefer that because they have the institutional setup to have reserve requirements on all kinds of things in the financial system, and that makes it easier to also implement these capital controls as a reserve requirement. Now, one important thing I want to emphasize is if central banks impose reserve requirements as a form of capital controls, it should be held in local currency and not in foreign currency, because that provides additional insurance to the country. So if you have a reserve requirement in local currency and you have a crisis and the currency depreciates, then foreigners lose some of their reserves, and that provides insurance to the country. It is also sometimes desirable to impose quantity measures instead of these price-based measures, and I think a reserve requirement is something in between. So some inflows may be so risky that it is best to prohibit them. For example, credit default swaps may be one type of that kind of instrument, or a lot of derivatives that allow financial market participants to circumvent other regulations. They may best be banned so that the capital controls that are imposed work in a tighter manner. How much time do we have?
For you, Anton, we'll give you whatever, 10-15 minutes.
Okay, so how should capital controls vary over the cycle? on the slide where I put my quantification, I first said, well, the externalities of dollar debt in Indonesia were 30% at the height of the crisis, but in a long-run average, they were 1.5%. So ideally, if we can impose time-varying controls, we should vary them over the cycle. And here I have depicted one graph from one of my papers that looks at the time dimension of optimal controls. And you can see from this graph that controls should optimally be pro-cyclical. So when we are in good times, that's when we accumulate the most debt. We should have the highest control. When we're in bad times, we can cut them to zero. And then as the economy recovers again, we can raise our controls again to keep track with the size of the increasing debt stock and the size of the increasing externalities. So, how should our controls depend on global macroeconomic factors? Well, oftentimes we are in a global economic environment that increases the scope for externalities and the scope for capital flows to emerging economies that impose particular dynamics. So we have just been in one of these episodes, and I hope we're slowly getting out of it. But basically, for much of the past 3-4 years, there was a shortage of global investment opportunities because much of the Western world had just suffered a big economic crisis. And in addition, there were a number of countries that accumulated large reserves. So that means there was a lot of supply of capital and very little demand. Well, there were some economies that were doing pretty decently well. It was mostly emerging market economies. And this entire global supply of capital therefore flowed towards emerging economies. So we observed low world interest rates, higher capital inflows. A lot of people call it hot money, and therefore greater crisis risk. And even though nothing in the emerging economies themselves changed, it led to greater externalities, and it made it optimal to raise capital controls in developed economies. And we saw in the past few years that quite a few countries actually did that. So this here is from one of my other papers, which basically shows the conditional probability of crisis after a surge in capital inflows. And the long-run average probability of crisis, which is basically an average across a wide sample of emerging market economies for the past 30 years, was close to 6%. But after you have just observed a surge in capital inflows, the average was significantly higher, so it rose above 8% for several years, and it took 5-6 years to be statistically insignificantly indistinguishable from the average over time. So we can see when countries had a large inflow of capital flows, it makes them more vulnerable, and they should impose greater regulations. Now, a question that is oftentimes debated is the effectiveness of capital controls. So the econometric evidence on how effective capital controls are is often very mixed. Now, the problem I would suggest is it is due to both endogeneity and heterogeneity. So what's the endogeneity problem? Well, which countries are most likely to impose capital controls? Those that have the largest inflows, because if you don't have an inflow problem, there's no reason to impose a control. So if you run just a standard OLS regression of inflows on capital controls, you get a positive coefficient, but of course that's reverse causality. It's not that the capital controls increased inflows, but it's the other way around. And that's a very fundamental problem, and since there is no really good instruments in this kind of literature, I think we still have econometrically not found a very good way of identifying the exogenous effect of capital controls on flows. Now, the most common findings, this is, for example, what's summarized in a recent paper by Nicholas Maggot and Carmen Reinhardt, is that controls are effective in changing the composition of inflows and in raising the cost of capital during booms, but only to a small extent. But in any case, both of these effects are desirable.
So I'm bringing this up because Suresh has left, but he might suggest that you just control for lagged inflows.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's decent control, but it doesn't fully address the problem.
Fair enough.
Because, I mean, let's think, for example, about Brazil in the fall of 2009. Brazil increased capital controls at the time. Within a couple of months, first 2% and 4% and 6%. And capital inflows actually rose during that time, in part because investors said, well, they are raising their controls, so we should get our money in before they raise them even higher. And that's a fact that you have a very hard time controlling such a simple instrument.
I agree, but if he can write a paper and get away with it, then you might be able to.
Now, a slightly paradoxical argument that is sometimes made is, well, we don't like capital controls because they raise the cost of finance for small firms, or they raise the cost of finance for investors, or all kinds of arguments along those lines. Now I want to point out, this is exactly the point of the controls. We want to raise the cost of finance for ideally everybody. In practice, it usually hits small firms more because they are more financially constrained. But that's the same, for example, for monetary policy. So that's just part of how financial market interventions work. Now, the details of regulation matter a lot. We know that in financial markets there is always a strong incentive to circumvent regulations because large amounts of money are at play. But there is a couple of lessons that we have learned in recent years from countries that have employed capital controls. So first of all, measures need to be broad and cover derivatives. If they don't cover derivative transactions, it's very easy to circumvent them. And then also regulations can be designed in a self-enforcing manner. For example, if you don't make your local courts enforce claims that have circumvented the capital controls, that's a very strong incentive to actually obey them. It's kind of similar to proscription. Now,
so that again, self-enforcing.
If you say that financial claims that have circumvented the capital controls are not enforced in your courts,
Right.
then that's a strong incentive to obey the capital controls.
Because then you have at least a party who will argue that that was an argument why they had that particular contract. So because one of the parties does not want the contract to be enforced, so the government doesn't even have to make the argument.
So yeah, the borrower would argue against the lender who has circumvented the controls ex post. And even though they may say in advance, well, I promise I pay you back and let's save this tax, ex post, the borrower has an incentive to renege on this promise and basically save the repayment. which also really helps the financial stability.
Yeah, and you can also use this for transparency, because one of the forms of circumvention is not disclosing derivatives. And so if you say you have not disclosed a derivative, it's not enforceable, then you also have, because if you disclose it, then the regulatory authority can say, that can directly interpret this as a circumvention.
Yeah, that's also a very important point. And I think another important point is that controls should be designed in a way to discourage intertemporal arbitrage. So I gave you this example about Brazil before, where I said, well, investors said, let's move in as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, because they may raise the inflow controls even higher. The problem with that was that the controls were only on inflows, and once they were in the country, there was no further control or tax on that. So if we applied the controls to the stocks and not to the flows, then this perverse incentive would be mitigated.
So that's a critique of like the Colombian and Chilean system of unremunerated reserve requirements.
Well, an unremunerated reserve requirement is a stock flow, right?
No, it's when the money goes in, it has to be in a bank account in the central bank for 6 months, unremunerated. So it's only the flows of money moving in.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes. So actually,
but it does stop round trips.
In principle, a reserve requirement can be designed to target the stock. So for the first 6 months, it will target precisely the stock, and it could be designed in a way that the stock is, for example, remunerated at different rates. That they earn interest while we don't have a capital inflow problem, and then when capital inflows get too large, we reduce the interest. Now, you're right, in practice, these reserve requirements often apply only to the first year or the first 6 months, and what that does is it discourages short-term flows. So there is some benefit to that as well. And I guess ultimately it depends on what it is that you really want to lean against. Is your problem mostly that you have short-term flows, or is your problem that you want to be able to change your control on the stock at a higher frequency? Yeah, so the details really do matter, as you can see from this exchange on very detailed features of capital controls. So, now how about alternatives to capital controls? So there's a number of alternatives that we can employ when inflows occur. For example, prudential controls in the banking system, or reserve accumulation, or contractionary monetary or fiscal policy. That was 4 minutes. Thank you. Now the problem is each of these has their own set of distortions. And one of the principles in regulation is you want to target externalities as closely as possible where they occur. So I'm currently working on a paper where I compare capital controls to pure prudential controls in the banking system that do not distinguish based on residence. So the defining feature of capital controls is that they discriminate between foreigners and domestic agents. Capital controls apply when you borrow from foreigners, but they don't apply when you borrow from domestic agents. So now the interesting thing that I realized in this paper is when you borrow from foreign agents and you repay foreign agents, you have a transfer problem. You have to transfer resources across borders, and that has a larger effect on your exchange rate than when you repay domestic agents. So when you repay domestic agents, there is no first order effect on your exchange rate. When you repay foreigners, it goes through the current account, through the capital account, and therefore it generally always has an exchange rate effect. Because of that, it is in general desirable to impose different regulations on foreign borrowing than on domestic borrowing. So I mean, we do want capital controls, even if we have a very strong and very good prudential regulation system in our domestic banking system. There's an additional issue, which is that controls can sometimes bypass the banking system. For example, if foreigners directly buy a corporate bond in our economy, and in those cases the prudential controls would not be able to hit or to target that flow anyways. So then we really need capital controls. So yeah, that's this here. Now, we can impose capital controls when we have an inflow problem. We can also engage in ex post measures once we are in this feedback loop and once we experience a financial crisis. So in principle, it is desirable to do whatever you can when you have a crisis, right? Because crises are costly, crises really reduce welfare. Now the problem is, once we are in a financial crisis, we really have very limited options. So if you let me go back a couple of slides to our loop here. In principle, once a crisis like this hits, we can again intervene at every point of this diagram. So we can intervene using policies that support demand, that support the exchange rate, that support balance sheets, but they're all very problematic. We already discussed that if we support the exchange rate, then we need higher interest rates, which hurts aggregate demand in a different way. Supporting aggregate demand is something that crisis countries very often cannot afford, because oftentimes the government is constrained at the same time as private agents are constrained. And supporting balance sheets, that's also a policy that is in principle possible, for example, to write down debts, debt forgiveness, but it's very difficult both politically because it involves clear distribution and because it's hard to target borrowers. So I gave you a number before that 95% of all Indonesian companies went bust in 97, 98. Well, that was in part because those that were healthy said, well, why should I repay my debt if nobody else does? So there was a lot of opportunistic default. So yeah, intervening in any of these three areas that are involved in the feedback loop is very difficult.
What about ex post capital controls, or capital outflows? That doesn't have the interest rate effect.
That's a very good question. So in general, and that's the interesting thing is, that's actually a policy that has been employed in a number of recent crisis episodes, even with the blessing of the IMF, to impose controls on capital outflows. So for example, in Cyprus or in Iceland, we have experienced, we've seen large controls on outflows, and one of the benefits of those controls is that they keep the exchange rate a little bit more stable than it would be otherwise. So yeah, that's also an exposed measure that is useful, but it is a very stark measure because a lot of people feel exposed. So in big crisis, I think it's almost possible not to do it. But yeah, it's costly, and that means we never want to focus only on the ex-post measures, but we want to complement them wherever we can with ex-ante measures to reduce crisis risk before the crisis actually occurs. Now, so this is now my last slide before I conclude. There's also spillover effects of capital controls. So in general, when one country receives fewer inflows, another country needs to receive larger inflows. It's just by the general equilibrium nature of the world economy. So the question is, well, should we worry about those spillover effects? And so there's different ways of thinking about that. First of all, are there strategic interactions between different countries? Well, yes, there are strategic complementarities. If one country imposes tighter controls, then others will receive greater influence and they have to impose tighter controls. However, those complementarities are generally desirable because they induce policymakers to regulate the externalities at the level where they occur. So let's say we have two countries, both of them have mild externalities. Let's say they have both a 1% tax on capital inflows. Now something happens and one country becomes really attractive and it increases its capital control because it experiences greater externalities from the greater flows. And then some of those capital flows get diverted to the first country. Then the other country also has to increase its capital controls to account for the fact that greater inflows lead to greater externalities. So that's absolutely desirable, and there's no need to worry about that. So in general, just because we see these strategic complementarities does not mean that we need to coordinate the use of capital controls at a global level.
One country could have a lower cost to using capital controls, and so that's not necessary.
So there is a number of conditions when there is a case for coordination, but and this would be one case. But I just want to say in general, we don't need to view the observation that there is these spillover effects and these complementarities as a reason for coordination. But yes, there is a few clearly identifiable cases where we do want to cooperate. So if one country can control their externalities more easily and another country cannot, then one country can help the other country. Because it's one country's inflows and the other country's outflows. So if I control my inflows or somebody else controls the outflows, doesn't make a difference. And it should generally be done by the one who can do it most instances. Yeah, so and a simple analogy to this observation would be, let's say we regulate the externalities of road traffic and balance sheet effects. The free market equilibrium is socially suboptimal, so the private sector takes on excessive systemic risk. And that provides us with a rationale for well-designed policy intervention. And let me tie that back to our very first slide. If we impose those capital controls that I discussed, we can increase both stability and efficiency in the economic system. So there's no trade-off between the two. Good regulation, smart regulation can always improve that. Okay.
Thank you very much. To make the following suggestion, we'd have take some time for questions, and we postpone the start of the next session by 15 minutes or so we can accommodate some discussion here, right? So, Rohini here, we'll inform her. Okay. In that, why don't you start?
On financial services rules in trade and investment agreements. And there's just kind of a few interesting intersections with some of the stuff that you're presenting. I mean, one is, you may know, sort of providers of, say, GDP indexed bonds or providers of credit default swaps would each be defined under some of these agreements as a specific type of financial service provider or a specific type of investor. And some of the distinctions you make between the tax rates would be basis for sort of a potential national treatment or discrimination claim under the way some of these rules are structured. And just so an interesting modification to, say that a certain type of financial service provider needing a 1.3% optimal tax rate. An interesting thing to just think about might be to add a certain margin to that in order that the government could accumulate a reserve in the event of sort of liability triggering under one of the investment or trade agreements. So if, say, Citigroup is in Korea and Citigroup is more likely to be a credit default swap provider than, say, a Korean bank, it might be interesting to have the government actually tax that at such a rate so that it additionally compensates for 5 years down the line when there's a claim for compensation from Citigroup. So I mean, it might just be interesting to try to think about adjusting the tax rates accordingly. And sort of similarly, an outright ban on a credit default swap would be sort of a limitation of market access for that provider as well. So anyway, it just could be sort of interesting to, and another interesting point is just that, you sort of pointed out some of the dynamic inefficiencies of having a less targeted policy, like say a prudential sort of across-the-board policy that would apply to all market participants, sort of regardless of their specific activity. And in a lot of these agreements, there's sort of arguably carve-outs for these kind of less targeted policies, but there's not carve-outs for the more targeted policies. So just kind of an interesting way that how trade agreements in some ways are promoting of an inefficiency sort of under your scheme.
Yeah, so I think that's a very important observation. In a lot of the investment treaties that have been written in recent years, there's been a lot of damage done to the ability of individual countries to protect themselves against risky capital flows. So, those investment treaties are terrible from a financial stability view because they prevent countries from doing exactly what they should do if they want to address these externalities. And what you described to increase the levy in order to offset a potential liability in the future, I think that's a fourth or fifth best policy, given that the investment treaty is viewed as sacrosanct. It may be a possible option. I mean, the best thing would be to not sign investment treaties like that.
Sanjay, Avanti, Sanjay, and then I think one other.
I really appreciated your presentation because as someone who's been part of on the periphery of this global civil society movement, it's kind of making these demands within development circles about imposing a financial transactions tax or a Tobin tax, and so to speak. It's interesting to see how economic theory can be used to devise what can be an optimal tax rate. But what I found a little troubling, and I might be a little provocative here, is that if you think about portfolio investments, which are the significant source of very risky capital flows, you say that the real gross return kind of comes up to 44%, and you estimate this optimal tax, which comes up to about 0.31%. It seems much lower than that, an FTT of about anywhere from 1 to 2%. And I'm wondering if it's to do with the fact that if this whole framing is only about devising a tax rate that internalizes externalities, but does not really address issues of redistribution, for instance, which is also important, right? If you think of it in an international sense between developed and developing countries, and what developing countries are capable of. So just wondering if you had any thoughts about it.
Yeah, so there's one thing that I wanted to say just to clarify, which is I called this broadly portfolio investment. What I meant was equity portfolio investment. So that means you buy stock investments, and if a crisis happens, you sell your stocks at 56% less, so you take a big loss, and essentially the country has become insured justify that loss.
So it does not.
If the foreigner hadn't bought the stock, then the country itself would have lost the 56%. So that's why these equity investments are somewhat more desirable than, for example, dollar debt. But now, so that's just a clarification I wanted to make. But more broadly speaking, I think what you are addressing is that this is just one particular view of the externalities of capital flows. And for example, this whole presentation was completely distribution neutral. And whenever we experience financial crisis, we know that one of the big things that really gets hit is the poorest people. And so if we incorporated an additional distributive perspective in our accounting for the costs of financial crisis, then these externalities may be quite a bit higher. So actually, in a recent paper of mine, I looked exactly at the redistributive effects of financial crisis and the redistributive effects of financial regulation. And one of the findings there was that whenever you have a crisis and whenever you do things that increase the probability of crisis, you redistribute away from labor towards capital, and or in particular towards the financial sector. And that's something that's not at all accounted here.
Also, if you included derivatives of equity, and that's where most risk comes from in capital flows, and are notorious for creating crises as well, right?
So you're basically seeing short sales, people speculate against their equity market. Yeah, that would be.
Because the scale and volume of that is trillions and trillions of dollars. So.
Yeah, that would be a very big risk factor. In some sense, that's similar to what Joe mentioned before, that once we are in a crisis, we may want to impose controls on outflows, like Cyprus or Iceland have done that. We may also want to impose controls on speculating against our equity market, so derivatives.
Maybe you could also clarify, these taxes are basically on gross flows.
So these are taxes on stocks.
On stocks.
So these are annual taxes on stocks.
Yeah. So the financial transaction tax is aimed at also at maturity of the holdings.
Yeah.
So it's not only on the stock, but people coming in and out.
Yeah.
That's
an additional factor it's not accounted here for. So in principle, I said on one of my previous slides, short-term things are more dangerous than long-term things because they carry a greater risk of being suddenly repatriated. And if we can distinguish that, we would want to impose higher taxes on the short-term flows than on the long-term flows. And that's missing here as well. So if you have, let's say, hot money that flows into portfolio investment, that would be much more dangerous than a long-term investment into domestic equities. And this is kind of the, you can view it as an average of the two. So we may want to impose differential controls. The problem is, it's sometimes very hard to tell in advance whether something will be a short-term or long-term flow, especially with liquid things like equity.
Sanjay.
Well, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you why you say there's no need for global coordination, just because there's strategic complementarity in the game of regulating capital inflows. The equilibrium, as it were, if you want to use that language, of that game need not be optimal.
So
socially optimal on your own account, it would seem.
I'm not saying that we never need coordination. I'm just saying that this observation is not enough to justify coordination.
It's not enough to reject it either. I mean,
that's right. So that's why I said no general need.
The equilibrium will not be socially optimal.
That's why I said no general need. I did not say we do not want, we never want coordination.
I think to avoid the wrong inference on the part of the audience, we should drop this claim.
No, I should add one more thing, which is that oftentimes this call for a need for global coordination has been used to delay the implementation of capital controls, and basically it has been used as a club to prevent countries from doing what they need from a financial stability perspective.
You could say that there's less need than would otherwise be in the absence of those interactions.
So I'm saying if there's this argument, that's not an argument why we need coordination. If we have other arguments like the one that Joe mentioned, that some countries may have inferior instruments and others superior instruments, in that case, there is a case for coordination. But I'm just saying we need to be very careful with this. And
let me put it in context. I mean, I've been in meetings at the IMF where the argument that the fact that you're imposing a control is causing an externality is used as an argument for you not to do it, and is used as an argument for the IMF to intervene and stopping you to have the control, because the IMF views its role as stopping negative externalities. And I think what you're saying is that's not an argument. If it actually reinforces the incentive to get a global system where each country has the appropriate, has a system of capital controls.
Yes, so let's say essentially you and I, we both have some externalities and we both want to impose controls on capital inflows. And when I raise my capital controls, you experience greater inflows and you don't like that. So that would have been the basis of this argument that Joe just made. I'm just saying, well, if I raise my controls and I have a lower demand, general equilibrium requires that somebody else absorbs that. And if my control was the efficient control, it has to be that you have the higher inflows, well, even if you don't like it.
Your argument is that we all have an individual interest in doing it, and moreover, each agent's interest is increased by the other people's doing it. But that doesn't preclude the possibility that we would also be better off still.
That's right.
That's right.
There's no contradiction.
That's right. That's right.
Well, last question.
Yeah, I mean, like in the sense that build up on what Sanjay is talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, like in one sense, it is a very absence of a general global coordination that was closely associated with what we understand today as the Great Depression of 1929 to 1933. When that's my understanding in any case. That's one thing. So I was wondering as to how you may want to comment upon that. The other is that, thanks, by the way, for a very lucid presentation. I mean, I liked it a lot. Yeah. The other is that this whole thing about regulation, re-regulation, and so on, is it not like really an exposed wisdom? I mean, exposed wisdom in the sense that there was a lot of regulation in the entire period 1945 to roughly 1973. That the entire global economy was regulated to a very important extent following the two world wars and the Great Depression of 29 to 33 and so on. So in one sense, there is a lot of, all this realization seems to be coming after the event, which is fine, I guess. There's no harm in learning. But again, is that not closely related to some attempt or the absence of an attempt at global coordination?
That's good questions. So let me first talk about my view of capital economy interventions in the 1930s. So I think one of the standard narratives of the worldwide Great Depression has been that all countries erected trade barriers, and that's why world trade collapsed. and that was an important factor in propagating the depression. Right?
Capital flows, the capital flows were.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say it may have played a little bit of a role. I think the much more important factor was that all countries had coordinated on following the wrong monetary policy, which was to keep the gold standard for too long. And if you look at the time series of when different countries recovered from the Great Depression, it was always after they left the gold standard. And so I think that was a much more important factor. Now,
can I just express some skepticism about that? Because if they had all left at the same time, then
we would have had inflation.
Well, it depends on what they would have done. But I guess the point I was going to make, the reason that those who left early did better was partly beggar than neighbor policies. They were gaining from the others. It doesn't follow from that if they had all left, the relative exchange rate would not have changed. And the only effect would have been whether with inflation. Yeah. And that, it doesn't necessarily follow that there would have been inflation. They could have had tight monetary policy even without the gold standard.
So they could have, I think inflation would have helped a lot during the balance sheet problems of the Great Depression.
But I guess what I'm saying is, we don't
I'm
have a
not
gold
saying
standard now,
completely-
and we're not having inflation, right?
And in Europe.
Or in the United States. And there's good reason to believe that in the 20s, I mean in the 30s, if they hadn't had the gold standard, they would not have had inflation. So I don't think that, I mean, that would have solved the problem.
Possibly. I think it would have helped. But yeah, I don't have strong views on the topic, let me say. So on your second comment, which actually, can you remind me what was the second question?
Exposed realization that we all need to regulate it.
Yeah, right.
Deregulation since 1978.
Thank you. Yeah, right. So yeah, I can only say I very much agree with that. In some sense, there has been this boom-bust cycle in general views on the desirability of liberalization. So 20 years ago, liberalization was the greatest thing in fashion, and nowadays we are realizing that maybe we've liberalized a few things a bit too much. But
Thank you very much, Anton. Stamina as well after so we postpone in 15 minutes later we start, right? So we'll inform.